Hello friends. Welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story.
Grace had never been one to dream beyond her means. She had grown up understanding the value of patience, of sacrifice, of enduring hardship with quiet resilience. Life had never been particularly kind to her, but it had been fair until she met Ethan. She was 23 when he first walked into her life, a man with nothing to his name except a restless determination and a charming smile. He had ambitions bigger than his pockets, dreams that reached far beyond the dusty streets of the town they both called home. His voice carried the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she believed him. Ethan was not wealthy, nor did he come from a family that could offer much beyond their name. His father had been a laborer, his mother a seamstress, and together they had raised him with the same grit and stubborn hope that he carried into adulthood. He was not content with small dreams, not satisfied with simply making a living, he wanted more. And when he spoke of that future, of the business he would build, of the success he would one day claim, Grace felt something stir inside her, belief. They married in the summer, when the air was thick with warmth and the scent of blooming flowers. It was not a grand wedding, there were no lavish decorations, no expensive dresses or catered meals. The ceremony was held in the backyard of Grace's childhood home, with only close friends and family gathered around them. She wore a simple white dress, one she had sewn herself, and Ethan held her hands with a conviction so strong that she felt it pulse through her skin. "We'll build a life together, Grace," he had whispered to her that evening as they sat on the small wooden porch of their rented home, looking up at the vast night sky. "It won't be easy, but I promise you, we'll have everything we ever wanted." She had believed him then, and for years, she held on to that promise like a lifeline. The early years of their marriage were difficult. Ethan worked tirelessly, taking on whatever jobs he could find, from construction work to selling goods in the market. Grace, too, contributed in whatever ways she could, sewing clothes for the neighborhood women, cleaning houses, sometimes even working as a cook for wealthier families in town. They lived in a cramped, one-bedroom house with a leaky roof and walls so thin that they could hear their neighbors arguing at night. There were times when their meals consisted of nothing more than rice and whatever vegetables they could afford from the market. But through it all, Grace remained steadfast. She believed in Ethan's dreams, and the future he spoke of so passionately. Whenever he came home late, exhausted from the day's work, she would be there, waiting with a warm meal and quiet encouragement. "It'll get better," she would say, stroking his tired face. "We just have to keep pushing forward." And they did. Slowly, Ethan's efforts began to bear fruit. He saved every extra penny he could, investing in a small trading business. It was a gamble, one that kept them teetering on the edge of financial ruin more times than Grace cared to admit. But somehow, through sheer determination and a little bit of luck, things began to change. His business grew. First, it was just a small stall at the market, selling goods imported from nearby towns. Then, as profits increased, he expanded, securing deals with suppliers and moving into a modest storefront. It was not wealth, not yet, but it was progress. And with every step forward, Ethan changed. Grace noticed it first in the way he carried himself. There was a new confidence in his stride, a certainty in his voice that had not been there before. He spoke differently, with an air of authority, as though he had finally become the man he always believed he was meant to be. At first, she was proud of him. She had watched him struggle, had seen him pour every ounce of himself into his work. He deserved success. He deserved the respect that came with it. But with that success came something else, something she couldn't quite place at first. Ethan began spending less time at home. The long hours he once spent working to provide for them did not lessen, but now they were filled with business meetings, with dinners and outings that did not include her. He surrounded himself with new people, wealthier men, influential figures in town. He spoke less of their future together and more of his own ambitions. Grace tried not to let it bother her. She reminded herself that this was what they had worked for, what they had sacrificed for. She convinced herself that he was simply caught up in the momentum of his success, that once things settled, he would return to the man she had married. But then, the changes became harder to ignore. Ethan no longer sought her advice, no longer included her in discussions about their finances or his business plans. When she asked questions, he brushed them off with a distracted nod or a vague answer. The affectionate glances, the tender moments they once shared, became scarce. And then, one evening, came the first real sign that everything had shifted. Grace had spent the day preparing a special meal, a rare treat, using ingredients she had carefully selected from the market. She had wanted to surprise Ethan, to remind him of the simple joys they had once shared. But when he finally came home, hours later than expected, he barely glanced at the meal before pushing the plate aside. "I already ate," he said, dismissively. She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just the meal, it was everything. The way he spoke to her, the way he barely acknowledged her presence anymore. It was as if she had become nothing more than a shadow in his life, something he barely noticed unless it inconvenienced him. "Ethan," she said softly, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "You're changing." He looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. And for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his expression, guilt, perhaps, or regret. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "I'm building something for us, Grace," he said, exasperation creeping into his tone. "You wanted this, didn't you? A better life?" She wanted to say that a better life meant more than just money, that it meant love, respect, partnership. But she didn't. Because deep down, she knew he wouldn't hear her. So she simply nodded, swallowing the ache in her chest. That night, as she lay beside him in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she realized something. The man she had married, the man she had built a life with, struggled with, dreamed with, was slipping away. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The change in Ethan was not immediate. It happened slowly, like a crack in the foundation of a house, small at first, barely noticeable, until one day, the entire structure threatened to collapse. Grace noticed it in the little things first. He stopped waiting for her in the mornings before leaving for work. When they were struggling, they had always eaten breakfast together, even if it was nothing more than bread and tea. It had been their ritual, a moment of quiet before the world demanded their attention. But now, she often woke up to an empty bed, the space beside her cold, his scent barely lingering. She told herself it was just his growing responsibilities. The business had expanded, and with that came more demands on his time. He was doing this for them, wasn't he? Wasn't this what they had wanted? But the reasoning felt hollow, a weak excuse against the growing distance between them. The conversations changed too. Where they once spoke of their dreams, their struggles, and their plans, their discussions became one-sided. Ethan would talk about his business, the people he had met, the deals he was negotiating, but he never asked about her day. If she tried to speak about herself, about something as simple as a book she was reading or a thought that had crossed her mind, his attention drifted. He would nod absent-mindedly, checking his watch, scrolling through his phone, or responding with vague hums that made it clear he wasn't really listening. And then, there were the absences. At first, Ethan had come home late once or twice a week, and Grace had accepted it without question. But then, once or twice turned into nearly every night. She would sit at the small dining table, a meal carefully prepared, waiting for him. Sometimes she tried to call, but his phone would ring endlessly before going to voicemail. Other times, he would answer with a short, clipped response. "Busy. Don't wait up." She tried to pretend it didn't hurt. One evening, after yet another lonely dinner, Grace decided to stay up. She sat in the dimly lit living room, watching the clock tick past midnight. When Ethan finally arrived home, his steps were slow, measured. He smelled faintly of alcohol, though he wasn't drunk. "You're still up?" His tone was one of mild surprise, not guilt. "I wanted to see you," she said softly. He sighed as he loosened his tie and walked past her toward the bedroom. Grace, you don't have to wait for me. I have a lot going on. She followed him, her heart beating faster. I know you do, Ethan. But we barely see each other anymore. Can't we? Grace, please, he cut her off, rubbing his temples. Not tonight. And that was the end of the conversation. A week later, Grace decided to visit him at his shop, something she hadn't done in a while. In the early days, she had been a part of it all, helping with small tasks, supporting him however she could. But over time, Ethan had stopped including her, and she had slowly withdrawn. When she arrived, she was met with unfamiliar faces. New employees, people she had never seen before, bustled around, speaking to Ethan with a level of deference she had not expected. Her husband, once humble and eager to learn, now carried himself with the confidence of a man who commanded respect. Grace waited until he was free, standing by the counter as she watched him shake hands with a business associate. When he finally noticed her, his expression was unreadable. "What are you doing here?" His tone was not welcoming, not warm. It was almost embarrassed. She faltered. "I wanted to see how things were going. It's been a while since I—" Ethan glanced around, as if checking to see who was watching. "Grace, you should have called. I'm in the middle of something." It was the way he said it, the way he looked at her, not as his wife, not as the woman who had stood by him when he had nothing, but as an inconvenience. As if she didn't belong in this part of his life anymore. The moment was brief, passing in the span of a breath, but it left a sharp, aching void in her chest. "I'll see you at home," she murmured, turning to leave before he could say anything else. That night, she didn't wait for him. Days turned into weeks, and the gap between them grew wider. Grace tried to pretend things were normal, but the reality weighed heavily on her. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty. She spent more time alone, filling her days with small distractions, cleaning, cooking, reading, anything to keep her mind from wandering too far into the painful truth. One evening, as she folded laundry, she noticed something unusual. Ethan's shirt smelled of a perfume she didn't wear. It was faint, almost undetectable, but it was there. She held the fabric to her nose, inhaling deeply, her stomach twisting. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell herself she was imagining things. But doubts had already begun to take root, and once they did, they were impossible to ignore. She started paying closer attention. The way Ethan was always checking his phone, the way he stepped outside to take calls, the way he avoided her touch. It was as if he had already pulled away, but he was too much of a coward to say it outright. One night, she confronted him. "Ethan, are you seeing someone else?" The words felt heavy, foreign, like they didn't belong in the space between them. He looked at her, genuinely surprised. "What? No. What kind of question is that?" She swallowed hard. "Then why are you acting like this? Why are you always gone? Why do you look at me like I'm a stranger?" Ethan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Grace, I don't have time for this. My business is growing. I have responsibilities. I can't be sitting at home all the time just to make you feel better." Her throat tightened. "That's not what I'm asking. I just want to know if you still—" "Grace," he interrupted, his voice sharp, "I don't have the energy for this." She felt the weight of his dismissal like a slap. He didn't deny it. He didn't reassure her. He just refused to engage, as if her concerns weren't worth his time. And maybe, she realized, they weren't. That night, Grace lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling a profound sense of loneliness settle over her. She had given Ethan everything, her love, her time, her unwavering support. She had believed in him when no one else had stood beside him through struggle and sacrifice. And now, as she listened to his steady breathing beside her, she wondered if he had ever truly seen her at all. Something in her heart shifted, just a little. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter, something colder. Something that whispered, "You won't be invisible forever." It began with words. Sharp, cutting words that left deeper wounds than any physical strike ever could. At first, Ethan's anger came in short, irritated remarks, dismissive, indifferent, as though every interaction with Grace was an inconvenience. If she asked him a question, he answered with impatience. If she voiced a concern, he met her with exasperation. If she lingered too long in his presence, he sighed, as if her very existence exhausted him. One evening, she placed a bowl of stew in front of him, just as she always had. He barely looked up from his phone, scrolling through something with a furrowed brow. She waited for him to take the first bite, but he didn't. "Ethan," she said softly. "Nothing." "Ethan." He exhaled sharply and set his phone down with an audible thud. "What?" "I was just wondering how your day was." His jaw tensed. "Busy." She hesitated. "Did you?" "Grace," he snapped, his voice tight with frustration. "Can I eat in peace?" The way he looked at her, the way his eyes burned with barely concealed irritation, made her shrink back. She felt foolish, like a child who had asked too many questions, like a burden rather than a wife. She watched as he picked up his spoon, took a bite, then pushed the bowl away. "Too much salt," he muttered, standing up. Grace glanced at the stew. She had tasted it before serving it. There was no extra salt. But she said nothing. It was easier that way. The shift from words to actions was gradual. The first time he grabbed her wrist, it wasn't out of anger, at least, not entirely. He had been leaving for work, and she had instinctively reached out to touch his arm, a desperate attempt to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers. "Ethan, please, can we just talk?" He yanked his arm away so roughly that her balance faltered. His grip was firm, almost bruising, as his fingers dug into her skin. "Grace, stop," he said through clenched teeth. "Not everything has to be a conversation." She stared at him, wide-eyed, her wrist stinging from the pressure. And then, just as quickly as he had grabbed her, he let go, rubbing a hand over his face. "I'm late," he muttered, turning toward the door. She stood there long after he had gone, rubbing the tender spot on her wrist. Maybe it had been an accident. Maybe he hadn't meant to be so rough. But deep down, she knew. The first slap came on a Sunday afternoon. Grace had spent the morning cleaning, trying to make the house feel warm again, trying to recapture something that had long since faded. She had changed the curtains, rearranged the furniture, and even placed fresh flowers on the dining table. It was a foolish attempt, but she had wanted to make things feel new, to remind them both of the home they had built together. Ethan walked in just as she was setting the last dish on the table. She smiled at him, hopeful. "I made lunch," she said. He didn't respond. He barely glanced at the food before stepping past her and heading to the bedroom. Grace's smile faltered, but she followed him. "Ethan," she tried again, standing in the doorway. "Can we sit down together? Just for a little while?" He was unbuttoning his shirt, moving with the same detached disinterest that had become his norm. "I already ate." Her heart sank. "Where?" He glanced at her then, his gaze darkening. "Does it matter?" "Yes," she said, more firmly than she had intended. "It matters to me." Ethan sighed, shaking his head as he pulled off his shirt. "Grace, I don't have time for this." "You never have time," she shot back. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "You never have time for me, for us, for anything but." The slap came so quickly, so suddenly, that for a moment, she didn't register what had happened. There was only the sharp sting, the way her head jerked to the side, the sound of her own breath hitching in her throat. Silence hung between them like a heavy, suffocating fog. Ethan's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. His hand was still suspended in the air, as if even he couldn't believe what he had done. Grace lifted trembling fingers to her cheek, feeling the warmth of her own skin beneath the sting. And then, Ethan did something unexpected. He stepped forward, reaching for her. "Grace, I..." She flinched. Something flickered across his face, guilt, perhaps, or something close to it. But he didn't apologize. Instead, he turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, almost to himself. You made me angry." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand that he look at her, that he see what he had done. But she said nothing. Because in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't the first time Ethan had hurt her. It was just the first time he had left a mark. That night, Grace lay awake, her cheek still throbbing. Ethan slept beside her, his breathing deep and steady, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't struck her, as if he hadn't shattered something between them. She stared at the ceiling, blinking back the sting of tears. What was she supposed to do? Where was she supposed to go? She had given everything to this marriage, to this man. She had been with him when he had nothing. She had built this life with him, sacrificed for him. And now, what did she have to show for it? A fading bruise on her cheek. A home that no longer felt safe. A husband who no longer loved her. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But in the darkness, a quiet thought whispered through her mind, chilling in its simplicity. This is not the end. And she didn't know whether that terrified her or reassured her. The bruise took days to fade. In the beginning, it was deep and angry, a darkening stain on her cheekbone that pulsed every time she moved her face. She avoided mirrors, but she could feel it, feel the heat of it beneath her fingertips whenever she dared to touch it. Ethan didn't mention it. Not once. He carried on as if nothing had happened, as if his hand had never struck her, as if she hadn't spent the night lying awake beside him, trapped between shock and silent despair. And maybe, in his mind, nothing had happened. Maybe, to him, it was just a brief moment of frustration, something insignificant, something to be forgotten as quickly as it had occurred. But Grace couldn't forget. She caught herself flinching when he moved too quickly. She measured her words more carefully, treaded lightly around him as though he were an unpredictable storm that could turn violent at any moment. It was exhausting. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the shame. Because no matter how much she tried to convince herself that this wasn't her fault, a small, cruel voice inside her whispered, "You let this happen. You stayed." The days continued as they always had, each one blending into the next. Ethan went to work. Grace remained at home. The silence between them grew heavier, thicker, like an invisible wall neither of them wanted to acknowledge. She no longer tried to reach for him. No longer waited up for him. No longer asked where he had been. But she watched. She watched as he came home at odd hours, as he avoided her gaze, as he smelled the faint traces of perfume that didn't belong to her. She watched as he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who no longer had to pretend, who no longer felt the need to play the role of a loving husband. One evening, she was folding laundry in their bedroom when she heard his phone buzz on the nightstand. Ethan was in the shower. The sound came again, a soft vibration, persistent, insistent. Grace's hands froze over the shirt she had been folding. She wasn't the kind of woman who checked her husband's phone. She had always believed that trust should be given freely, that suspicion was a poison that could rot even the strongest of marriages. But trust had already been broken. Suspicion had already taken root. Before she could talk herself out of it, she reached for the phone. The screen lit up. A message. "Last night was amazing. When will I see you again?" The breath left her lungs in a sharp, painful exhale. Her hands trembled as she stared at the words, her vision blurring at the edges. She had known. Of course, she had known. The late nights, the distant stares, the scent of another woman's perfume, she had seen all the signs, had felt them. But knowing was different from seeing the proof right in front of her. She wanted to scream. To cry. To throw the phone against the wall and demand answers. But she did none of those things. Instead, she placed the phone back exactly as it had been, her movements slow, deliberate. Then she walked into the bathroom, where Ethan was still showering. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the steam curl through the air, listening to the sound of water cascading over his skin. He was humming. The realization made something in her chest twist painfully. She was drowning in pain, and he was humming. The next few weeks passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Grace didn't confront Ethan. She didn't tell him what she had seen. She simply observed. She watched the way he smiled at his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he left the room to take calls. The way he seemed lighter, freer, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. And she realized something bitterly ironic. Ethan was happy. Not with her. Not in their home. But somewhere else. With someone else. And she? She was nothing more than a shadow in the life they had built together, a quiet presence he no longer acknowledged unless it was to snap at her or demand something from her. One night, after Ethan had left for another one of his business meetings, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty plate in front of her. She wasn't hungry. She hadn't been for a while. Her mind kept circling back to the same question. What am I still doing here? She had given this marriage everything. Her love, her devotion, her loyalty. And in return, she had been cast aside like she was nothing. She had endured neglect, humiliation, betrayal. And now she had endured violence. And yet, she was still here. She thought about packing a bag, about leaving, about disappearing into the night without a word. But then, what? Where would she go? What would she do? She had tied her entire existence to Ethan. Her home, her stability, her future, all of it was bound to him. And deep down, an even darker thought whispered in the back of her mind. If she left, he would move on effortlessly. He wouldn't chase after her. He wouldn't regret losing her. He would replace her, just as he had already begun to. The idea of it, of being so easily discarded, made something inside her burn. No. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She wouldn't be the one to walk away. She had stood by him when he was nothing. She had built this life with him, sacrificed for him. If anyone was going to leave with nothing, it wouldn't be her. It would be him. And for the first time in a long while, Grace felt something other than sadness. She felt a spark. Small. Flickering. But undeniably there. She didn't act on it yet. Not yet. For now, she would wait. She would bide her time. Because the thing about shadows? They may be silent. They may be overlooked. But they always remain. And one day, when the moment was right, she would step out of the darkness. And Ethan would finally see her. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that came from absence. It wasn't that Ethan was never home. No, he still returned at night, still walked through the same doors, still slept in the same bed. But there was a hollowness between them, a vast, unspoken chasm where love had once lived. Grace moved through the days as if she were a ghost in her own home. She cooked his meals, cleaned his clothes, performed the duties expected of her. But she no longer spoke unless spoken to. She no longer sought his attention, no longer watched the door in anticipation of his return. And Ethan? He barely noticed. It was as though he had already rewritten the story in his mind, one where she was simply another fixture in his life, no different from the furniture or the walls that enclosed them. But Grace noticed everything. She noticed how often his phone lit up with messages he'd never let her see. She noticed the way he left early and came home late, how his excuses grew thinner, how his patience with her had long since worn away. She noticed the scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirt collars, how he barely bothered to hide it anymore. And most of all, she noticed how little she mattered to him now. But that was fine. Because she had stopped caring, too. At least, that's what she told herself. The first time she made the tea, she hesitated. The packet lay in her palm, small and inconspicuous. The powder inside was nearly odorless, tasteless, undetectable in the strong, rich brew she had prepared. She had read about it days before, researched it quietly, methodically, in the dark hours of the night when Ethan lay beside her, oblivious. She had scrolled through articles, learned about the effects, the slow deterioration it caused. It wouldn't be immediate. No, that was too risky, too obvious. This had to be gradual, untraceable. A slow unraveling. She stood by the counter, staring at the steaming cup, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against her ribs. Then, without a second thought, she tipped the powder in, stirring gently until it dissolved completely. By the time Ethan sat at the table, the tea was already waiting for him, just as it always had been. He barely spared her a glance as he reached for the cup. Grace sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching as he took the first sip. Nothing happened. Of course, nothing would. Not yet. But she felt something shift inside her, something quiet and powerful. She had spent so long feeling powerless. But not anymore. Days passed. Then weeks. Ethan never suspected a thing. He drank the tea every evening without question, never once pausing to consider what lay beneath its familiar taste. And slowly, the changes began. At first, they were small. He complained of headaches, rubbing his temples in frustration. His appetite lessened, his moods turned unpredictable, more irritable, more fatigued. One evening, as he stood from the table, he swayed slightly, gripping the edge for balance. Grace looked up from her plate, feigning concern. "Are you all right?" Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head as though trying to clear it. "Just tired." She nodded, returning to her meal as if nothing was amiss. But inside, she felt a cold satisfaction settle in her bones. It had begun. The decline was slow, just as she had planned. Ethan's strength waned little by little, his once confident strides turning sluggish, his sharp temper giving way to exhausted frustration. One night, as he changed out of his work clothes, Grace caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror. He looked different. Thinner. Paler. Shadows clung beneath his eyes, dark and hollow. His skin had lost its usual color, his features drawn tight with exhaustion. She watched as he ran a hand down his face, exhaling heavily. Something inside her twisted at the sight. Not guilt, never guilt. But something else. A reminder of who he had once been. Who they had once been. There had been a time when she would have rushed to him, worried, desperate to make things better. A time when she would have held his face between her hands and begged him to tell her what was wrong. But that time had long since passed. And Ethan had made his choice. Now, she was making hers. One evening, as she stood in the kitchen preparing his tea, Ethan appeared in the doorway. His gaze was different tonight. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in what felt like years. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice hoarse. Grace turned, tilting her head slightly. "Have I?" He steadied her, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. She waited, wondering if this was the moment he would ask the right questions, if some distant part of him still cared enough to notice the shift in her. But then, just as quickly, the moment passed. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Forget it." Grace watched as he sank into the chair, exhaustion weighing heavily on his frame. She turned back to the tea, pouring the steaming liquid into his cup. This time, she added a little more. The nights grew longer. Ethan's body betrayed him more and more with each passing day. His hands trembled sometimes, his vision blurred. He visited doctors, but they found nothing. Stress, they said. Overwork. Perhaps a virus. They prescribed rest. Advised him to take better care of himself. But Ethan didn't rest. And Grace? She just smiled. She waited. She listened as he tossed and turned at night, as he groaned in discomfort, as he muttered in his sleep. She watched as he struggled to button his shirts in the morning, his fingers sluggish and uncooperative. She observed it all with the quiet patience of a woman who had spent too many years waiting for something to change. And now, finally, it was. One morning, as Ethan sat at the table, staring blankly at his untouched plate, Grace placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't look well," she murmured. He didn't flinch away this time. Instead, he exhaled shakily, rubbing his face. "I don't feel well." Grace pursed her lips. "Maybe you should take some time off work." He let out a humorless chuckle. "I can't." She tilted her head. "Why not?" He didn't answer. But she already knew. There was someone else now. A woman who occupied his thoughts, his time, his affection. And he couldn't afford to show weakness. Not to her. Not to anyone. Grace smiled softly, squeezing his shoulder. "Then let me take care of you." He sighed, leaning into her touch for the briefest of moments. Then he picked up his cup and took a slow sip. And Grace? She just watched. Waiting. Always waiting. Not just physically, though that was the most obvious. His once strong, broad frame was beginning to look unfamiliar. His shirts hung looser, the sharp lines of his jawline were softening, and his skin no longer carried the warmth it once did. He moved slower now, with a stiffness that hadn't been there before, as if his very bones had grown heavier. But it wasn't just his body that was failing him. His mind, too, seemed to be slipping. Grace watched it all unfold in silence. She saw the way his brow furrowed when he tried to remember something that should have been simple. The way he would start a sentence, only to trail off, his thoughts tangling in a way that frustrated him. She saw the flickers of fear in his eyes when his own body betrayed him. But he never spoke of it. Ethan had always been a man who prided himself on his strength, his control. Admitting weakness was not in his nature, and even now, when his body was giving him every reason to question what was happening, he refused to acknowledge it. Instead, he pretended. He forced himself out of bed in the mornings, even when it took him longer than it should have. He pushed through his daily routines, gritting his teeth through the exhaustion. And Grace? She helped. Softly. Gently. As though she were a loving wife, tending to a husband who needed her. She placed his tea in front of him every evening, watching as he drank it without hesitation. She prepared his meals, making sure he ate, even when his appetite wavered. She offered him quiet reassurances when he groaned in discomfort, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead on the nights when the headaches left him breathless. And through it all, she never let him see the truth. That she was not his caretaker. She was his executioner. The first time he nearly collapsed, it happened in the hallway. Grace had been in the kitchen when she heard the dull thud. She turned, her heart hammering, not in panic, but in anticipation. When she stepped into the hallway, she found him bracing himself against the wall, his breath ragged. His forehead glistened with sweat, and his hands were shaking as he tried to steady himself. She approached him slowly, her face a mask of concern. "Ethan?" He didn't answer right away. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his knuckles turning white against the wall. Then, finally, he muttered, "Dizzy." Grace reached for him, her hands cool against his burning skin. "Come sit down." He let her guide him to the couch, sinking onto it heavily. She crouched beside him, watching the way his fingers trembled against his thighs. This was different. Up until now, his decline had been slow, subtle. A steady unraveling. But this was the first time his body had truly failed him. The first time he couldn't simply shake it off. And she could tell it frightened him. She waited until his breathing steadied before speaking. "Ethan, maybe you should see another doctor." His jaw tightened. "They won't find anything. But you're getting worse." "I know." The admission came so quietly that for a moment, she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. Ethan had never been the kind of man to admit to weakness, to vulnerability. And yet, here he was. Falling apart. The realization sent a shiver through her. She reached for his hand, her fingers light against his skin. "Then what do you want to do?" He swallowed hard, his gaze distant. "I don't know." And for the first time in years, she saw him as he truly was. Not as the man who had hurt her. Not as the husband who had betrayed her. But as someone small. Someone afraid. As the days passed, Ethan's decline became impossible to ignore. The exhaustion became constant. His limbs felt heavier, his steps slower. His headaches were no longer just occasional, they were near constant, leaving him irritable and withdrawn. Some nights, Grace would wake to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, breathing deeply as if trying to steady himself. Other nights, she would catch him staring at his reflection in the mirror, his expression unreadable. And then there were the moments when he simply forgot. It wasn't anything drastic, not yet. But she noticed the little things. The way he would reach for something and pause, as if unsure why he had wanted it in the first place. The way he would enter a room, hesitate, then leave without explanation. The way his sentences would trail off, leaving an emptiness behind them. He never mentioned it. Never voiced his fears. But Grace saw. And she knew. He was beginning to wonder. To question. To suspect. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Ethan barely touched his food. Grace watched him, waiting. Finally, he set down his fork and exhaled heavily. Something's wrong with me. It wasn't a question. She tilted her head. You've been under a lot of stress. Ethan shook his head. It's more than that. A pause. Then, softly, I think I'm dying. Grace's fingers curled around the edge of her napkin, hidden beneath the table. She had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when he could no longer ignore the truth, when the fear would grow too heavy to push aside. Still, hearing the words spoken aloud sent a thrill down her spine. She forced herself to frown, to reach for his hand in a gesture of comfort. Don't say that. But Ethan's gaze was distant, unfocused. I can feel it, Grace. Every day, I feel weaker. My body, it's failing me. She squeezed his hand gently. We'll find out what's wrong. He let out a humorless chuckle. And if there's no answer? She didn't respond. Because there wouldn't be an answer. Not one he could accept. Not one he could fight. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering in his eyes. Maybe it's something I did, he muttered. Maybe I. He stopped suddenly, his expression shifting. Grace tensed. He was thinking. Piecing things together. Not yet. She couldn't let him see the pattern. Not now. So she leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles, distracting him with the warmth of her touch. Don't stress yourself, she murmured. We'll figure it out. His shoulders sagged, the fight slipping from him. And just like that, the moment passed. For now. But Grace knew the war wasn't over. Ethan was slipping away, his mind fraying at the edges. But somewhere deep inside him, something was still fighting. And she had to make sure he lost. Because the end was coming. And it belonged to her. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan did little to fill the silence that sat between them like an invisible wall, thick and impenetrable. Ethan lay beside her, his breathing uneven, a soft wheeze slipping from his lips every now and then. He shifted often, never truly finding rest. Grace listened. She always listened. It had become a habit now, the way she stayed awake longer than she should, her body still, her breathing slow and controlled, waiting for any sign of change. And there were changes. Subtle, but undeniable. Ethan had started sweating in his sleep, his body burning with an unnatural heat one moment, trembling with cold the next. His limbs twitched occasionally, small, involuntary spasms that made his fingers curl against the sheets. But the worst part was the fear. Not his. Hers. Not the kind of fear that made her second-guess what she was doing. No, that doubt had died a long time ago. This fear was something else. A fear of discovery. Of time slipping away from her. Because lately, Ethan had been looking at her differently. Not with love, he had long since abandoned that. Not with anger, that, too, had faded. But with curiosity. With suspicion. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, the way his questions came slower, more deliberate. He was noticing things. He was thinking. And that could not be allowed. The next morning, Grace prepared breakfast with practiced ease, her hands moving automatically as she arranged his plate. Scrambled eggs, toast, a few slices of fruit. His tea, steaming beside it. When Ethan entered the kitchen, he looked more exhausted than ever. His once bright eyes were now dull, weighed down by the kind of fatigue that seeped into the bones. He ran a hand down his face before lowering himself into the chair across from her. She watched as he reached for the tea. He hesitated. Just for a second. Then he lifted the cup to his lips and took a slow sip. Grace felt her stomach tighten. Something was wrong. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Ethan exhaled heavily. "Not really." She tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. He set the cup down carefully, his fingers drumming against the table. "I had a dream," he murmured. Grace's heart skipped. "A dream?" He nodded, his gaze distant. It felt real. A pause. Then, softly, "You were in it." She swallowed, keeping her expression neutral. "What happened?" Ethan let out a slow breath. "I don't know. I can't remember the details. Just a feeling." A chill ran down her spine. A feeling. What kind of feeling? But she didn't ask. Instead, she reached for his hand across the table, her touch gentle. "Maybe it was just the stress," she offered. Ethan's fingers tensed beneath hers. "Maybe," he muttered. But she could tell, he didn't believe it. By afternoon, Ethan's condition worsened. He spent most of the day in his office, the door half open, a forgotten pen resting between his fingers. Grace passed by occasionally, peeking in just enough to see him staring blankly at his desk, lost in thought. This wasn't like before. Before, his decline had been steady, predictable. His exhaustion had weighed him down, made him weaker, more dependent on her care. But now, there was something else. A shift. A tension that hadn't been there before. It made her uneasy. So, when evening arrived, she moved with careful precision, her hand steady as she prepared his tea. This time, she was more generous with the powder. A little extra. Just enough to push him further over the edge. When she carried the cup to him, he was sitting in the living room, rubbing his temples. She placed the tea beside him, her movements smooth, natural. "Drink," she urged softly. "It'll help." He didn't respond right away. Then, slowly, he reached for the cup. But instead of drinking, he stared at the liquid inside. Grace felt her breath catch. Seconds passed. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You always make my tea." Her fingers curled against her lap. "Of course I do." He looked up then, his gaze sharp despite his exhaustion. "Why?" The word hummed between them, heavy and dangerous. Grace forced a smile. "Because I take care of you." Ethan held her gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he lifted the cup to his lips and drank. That night, something changed. Ethan didn't sleep. Or, if he did, it wasn't restful. Grace woke several times to the sound of him shifting beneath the sheets, his breath uneven. At one point, she reached for him, her fingers brushing his arm. He flinched. She froze. It was quick, barely noticeable. But it was there. A reaction. A warning. Ethan had always been unpredictable, his mood shifting without notice. But this was different. This was something she hadn't seen before. A distance. A knowing. He was watching her. Even now, as he lay beside her, his body rigid, she could feel it. He was beginning to understand. And if she wasn't careful, he would figure it out completely. She needed to act. And soon. The next day, Ethan didn't touch his tea. He sat at the breakfast table, his fingers tapping against the rim of the cup, but he didn't drink. Grace felt her pulse quicken. "You should drink before it gets cold," she said. He didn't look at her. Didn't acknowledge the words at all. Then, after a long pause, he said, "What if I stopped drinking it?" Her hands tightened around her napkin. "Why would you?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "No reason." But there was a reason. She knew it. He knew it. Something inside her coiled, tense and unrelenting. He was questioning things now. The routine. The patterns. Her. And if he stopped drinking the tea, if he stopped, everything she had worked for would begin to crumble. She couldn't allow that. Not when she was so close. So, she reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over his. "You need to take care of yourself, Ethan," she murmured. "Please." His gaze flickered to hers, unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. He lifted the cup. Drank. And Grace? She let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Ethan was slipping further away from himself. But he wasn't gone yet. And until he was, she had to be careful. Because one wrong move, and everything would fall apart. Ethan had not spoken much since that morning at breakfast. He moved through the house with slow, measured steps, his presence reduced to a shadow of what it once was. His shoulders, once proud and squared, had begun to slump, his back slightly bent forward as though the weight of something unseen was pressing down on him. Grace observed him carefully, adjusting her actions where necessary. She still made his tea, still placed it before him at the usual times. But now, she did so with a heightened awareness. She no longer took his compliance for granted. Every sip he took was a quiet victory, a reassurance that her plan had not yet unraveled. But the doubt lingered. There was something about the way Ethan carried himself now, something about the way his gaze lingered on her at odd moments, as if he were studying her, looking for something beneath the surface. He was watching her. Not openly. Not confrontationally. But she felt it. It made her uneasy. One evening, as the sky bled into hues of orange and purple, Ethan sat outside on the porch, staring into the distance. Grace hesitated before stepping outside, carrying a cup of tea. "Thought you might want this," she said, keeping her voice light. Ethan didn't turn to look at her right away. His fingers drummed against the wooden armrest of the chair. Then, finally, he reached out and took the cup, cradling it between his palms. But he didn't drink. Grace lowered herself into the chair beside him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The air was thick with the scent of the earth cooling after the day's heat. A few crickets had begun their evening song, filling the quiet that stretched between them. "You've been quiet," she murmured after a while. Ethan let out a slow breath. "Just thinking." "About what?" He took a long moment before responding. "About life. The way things change." Grace tilted her head slightly. "Change can be good. Or bad." A pause. Then, softly, "I feel like I'm forgetting something." Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Ethan finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. It's like there are the gaps. Like pieces of my mind are slipping through my fingers, and I can't catch them fast enough." He lifted the cup toward his lips, then stopped. His gaze flickered to the tea, his brows drawing together in thought. Grace forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression neutral. "Does it taste different?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Ethan shook his head. "No." But he didn't drink. That night, Grace lay awake longer than usual, staring up at the ceiling. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, thick and heavy like a storm waiting to break. Ethan was slipping, yes. His health was failing, his body betraying him piece by piece. But something about the way he carried himself now was different. He wasn't just tired. He was aware. The realization sent a wave of unease through her. Had she miscalculated? Had she let something slip? She turned her head slightly, peering at Ethan through the dim light. He was lying on his side, facing away from her. His breathing was slow, steady. But something about the way he held himself felt unnatural. Like he was pretending to sleep. A shiver crawled up her spine. She turned onto her back again, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She needed to be careful. She was so close. She couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The next morning, Ethan didn't come downstairs right away. Grace moved through the house with forced ease, setting the table, preparing breakfast, keeping her movements calm and measured. She glanced at the clock. Then at the stairs. Finally, after another stretch of silence, she climbed the steps and pushed open the bedroom door. Ethan was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked up when she entered. "You okay?" she asked. Ethan studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Just tired." She hesitated before stepping further into the room. "Breakfast is ready." He nodded again but didn't move. Grace felt the unease creeping up her spine again. Something was shifting. She could feel it. She just didn't know how. When Ethan finally joined her at the table, his movements were slower than usual. He picked at his food absent-mindedly, his gaze distant. And then, in the middle of their quiet meal, he spoke. "I saw the doctor yesterday." Grace's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She forced herself to remain calm, setting it down slowly. "You did?" Ethan nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "Yeah." A pause. "They ran some tests." Grace's pulse quickened. She kept her expression neutral. "And?" Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "Nothing conclusive yet. They want me to come back for more tests." Her fingers curled slightly against her lap. This was dangerous. She had been careful, meticulous. She had ensured that his symptoms wouldn't point directly to any one illness, that the decline would feel gradual, natural. But doctors had a way of seeing what others didn't. She needed to stay ahead of this. "Maybe it's just stress," she murmured. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Maybe. But she could tell, he didn't believe it. Over the next few days, Ethan continued his quiet observations. Grace could feel them, even when he wasn't looking at her directly. There was something calculating in his gaze now, something thoughtful. She needed to act. She needed to finish this before he found the missing pieces. So that evening, as she stood in the kitchen, stirring his tea, she measured the powder carefully. A little more than usual. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to make sure the decline continued, that his body wouldn't have the strength to fight back. She carried the cup to him as he sat in the living room, setting it beside him with a small smile. "Drink," she urged softly. "It'll help." Ethan looked at her. Then, for the first time, he smiled. It was small. Subtle. But something about it sent a shiver down her spine. He lifted the cup. Brought it to his lips. Paused. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, he set it back down. Grace's breath caught. "I think I'll skip the tea tonight," he murmured. And just like that, everything changed. A line had been drawn, invisible yet undeniable. Grace felt it in the way the air thickened, in the way her pulse quickened just slightly, in the way Ethan's gaze held hers, calm, steady, unreadable. It was the first time he had openly refused the tea. The first time he had challenged her. She forced a soft smile. "Not in the mood?" Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his arm along the couch. "Just feel like giving it a break tonight." Her fingers curled subtly against her lap. "That's unusual for you." He shrugged. "Maybe it's time for something different." A simple statement. But there was meaning behind it. Something unspoken. A test. Grace knew she had to tread carefully. Maybe I'll make you something else, she offered lightly. Some warm milk, perhaps? Ethan chuckled, a quiet, humorless sound. You always take such good care of me. Something about the way he said it made her stomach twist. Was he mocking her? Or was he baiting her? She didn't like either possibility. But she couldn't afford to let doubt creep in. Not now. So, she simply smiled, collected the untouched cup of tea, and walked back to the kitchen. And for the first time, she felt the weight of his gaze following her, burning into her back. That night, she barely slept. Ethan lay beside her, his breaths even and steady, but Grace knew better than to assume he was asleep. Not anymore. She lay staring at the ceiling, her mind working tirelessly, trying to piece together the next move. He had seen a doctor. He had questioned the tea. He had refused it. What did that mean? Had he figured it out? Had he proven it? Or was he still searching for answers? If he had undeniable proof, he would have confronted her. Wouldn't he? The thought kept her rigid in bed, unable to relax. She needed to be sure. She needed to be one step ahead. The next morning, Grace moved through the house with careful precision. She prepared breakfast as usual, setting the table with quiet efficiency. Ethan came down a little later than usual. He looked the same, exhausted, pale, slower in his movements, but there was something else in his expression now. A quiet knowing. It made her stomach tighten. Coffee today? She asked, glancing at him as he took his seat. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You never offer me coffee, he said slowly. Grace forced a light chuckle. You usually prefer tea. His gaze held hers for a long moment before he nodded. Coffee sounds good. She turned away, preparing the cup with steady hands. But inside, she was unraveling. This was a shift. A power shift. He was controlling the narrative now. Testing her. And she had no choice but to follow along. She placed the cup in front of him, watching as he lifted it to his lips and took a slow sip. A sip he had chosen. A sip that she had not prepared with care. The moment felt heavier than it should have. Then, Ethan set the cup down and leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. I spoke to the doctor again. Grace's fingers tightened against the edge of the table. Oh? They got some results back. The world tilted slightly. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears, but she kept her face neutral. And? Ethan exhaled slowly. They said my body is reacting to something. Something foreign. Grace swallowed. That sounds concerning. He nodded. It is. Another pause. Then. They asked about my diet. About anything new I've been consuming regularly. Her grip on the chair tightened. What did you tell them? Ethan studied her for a long moment. I told them about the tea. The air between them grew thick, suffocating. Grace forced herself to keep her breathing steady. That makes sense. You've been drinking it a lot. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Another pause. Then, he tilted his head slightly. What kind of tea is it again? Grace blinked. He knew. Or at least, he was close enough to knowing. She could feel it in the way he asked, not out of curiosity, but out of expectation. He was waiting for her to lie. Waiting for her to stumble. She offered a small smile. Just a blend I found at the market. Ethan held her gaze for a moment before nodding. Interesting. But his tone said everything. He didn't believe her. And now, she knew he didn't. By afternoon, the tension in the house had become unbearable. Ethan sat in his office, the door slightly ajar. Grace stood outside for a moment, watching him. He was writing something down. Slowly. Methodically. Taking notes. Gathering evidence. A chill ran down her spine. This was no longer about a sick husband and a caring wife. This was a game now. A game of strategy. A game of survival. And she had to win. She stepped into the room. Need anything? Ethan didn't look up right away. Then, finally, he set his pen down and met her gaze. No, he said softly. His tone was calm, but his eyes held something dark. Something dangerous. A knowing. An accusation. Not even in the early days when they were struggling, when every evening was spent in exhaustion, when laughter was a luxury they couldn't afford. Now, the silence was different. It was heavy. It was waiting. Grace moved through the house with practiced ease, but her mind was anything but calm. Every action required calculation. Every word had to be measured. Ethan was watching. She could feel it in every interaction, in the way his eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. In the way he responded to her questions with slow, deliberate words, like he was studying her reactions. He wasn't just sick anymore. He wasn't just tired. He was playing a game. And now, so was she. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the living room, Grace prepared dinner. She moved methodically, chopping vegetables, seasoning the stew, stirring in slow, even motions. Behind her, she heard Ethan approach. He didn't speak right away. She turned slightly, offering him a small smile. Hungry? Ethan leaned against the doorway. Yeah. A pause. Then. Smells good. Grace nodded, keeping her hand steady as she continued stirring. Your favorite. A quiet chuckle. You always know what I like. There it was again. That tone. A weight behind his words. She turned off the stove, wiping her hands on a towel before turning to him fully. I'll set the table. Ethan watched her for a moment longer before nodding. I'll help. Dinner was quiet. The clinking of utensils against porcelain was the only sound between them. Grace stole glances at Ethan as he ate. His movements were slower than before, more deliberate. He chewed carefully, swallowing with effort. He was getting weaker. Her plan was still working. But then, in the middle of their meal, he set his fork down, folded his hands in front of him, and said, I know, Grace. She froze. Her grip on her own fork tightened just slightly before she set it down, her expression carefully neutral. Know what? She asked softly. Ethan exhaled, leaning back against his chair. His gaze was steady. Calm. Too calm. I know what you've been doing. Grace let out a soft, breathy laugh. You're not making any sense. Ethan didn't smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Then, slowly, he unfolded it and slid it across the table toward her. Grace hesitated. Then she picked it up. Her eyes scanned the words. And her heart stopped. Lab results. Ethan's blood work. And at the very bottom, traces of a foreign substance. A toxin. Grace felt the room closing in around her. She forced herself to look up, to meet his gaze with practiced confusion. What is this? Ethan tilted his head slightly. You tell me. A long silence stretched between them. The air felt too thick. The walls too close. Grace set the paper down carefully. You think I had something to do with this? Ethan's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. Not quite a smirk. You tell me, he repeated. For the first time in months, Grace felt cornered. She had been so careful. So meticulous. How had he found out? Had she slipped up? Had he been pretending all this time? She took a slow breath, leaning back in her chair. This is ridiculous. Ethan didn't blink. Is it? Yes. She crossed her arms, tilting her head. You think I'd do something like this? To you? Ethan exhaled. I didn't want to believe it. Another pause. Then, softer. But I started paying attention. The weight of those words settled between them. Grace felt her pulse hammering, but she kept her face smooth. You're sick, Ethan. You're paranoid. You're looking for someone to blame. I stopped drinking the tea. Her breath hitched. Ethan's gaze darkened. A few days ago. Silence. His next words were quiet, deliberate. My body started fighting back. A slow smile curled at the edges of his lips, one that sent a shiver up her spine. And for the first time since this had all begun, Grace felt fear. Real, raw fear. Because she had been so sure. So certain that he was slipping away. But now, he was here. And he was watching her. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Ethan remained in the living room, sitting in the armchair, staring out the window. Grace cleaned up slowly, methodically, trying to gather her thoughts. He knew. That much was clear. But what would he do about it? Would he go to the police? Would he confront her in anger? Would he? Her thoughts halted. Because for the first time, she realized something. Ethan wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing her with rage. He was calm. Too calm. Like he had already decided something. A cold chill ran through her veins. She needed to act. Fast. That night, as Ethan lay in bed beside her, breathing slow, steady, deep, Grace stared up at the ceiling. Her mind raced. Her heart pounded. She could feel the seconds slipping away, each one bringing her closer to a decision she didn't want to make. She had planned for this. She had always known that if Ethan ever figured it out, she'd have to finish what she started, quickly. She turned her head slightly, looking at him in the dim light. His face was peaceful. His body weak. She could do it tonight. One final dose. She could end it before he had the chance to stop her. Before he had the chance to win. Slowly, carefully, she slipped out of bed. Made her way to the kitchen. Reached for the small vial she had hidden at the back of the cupboard. She measured the dose with steady hands, stirring it into a fresh cup of tea. Then, just as carefully, she walked back upstairs. Ethan was still lying in bed, eyes closed. She stood over him, holding the cup, her breath slow and controlled. Then, his eyes flickered open. And he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. I was wondering how long it would take, he murmured. And that was when she realized. She had already lost.
Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.